Hi everybody, thanks for joining me today. My name is Tracy Calder and I am the co-founder of Close-Up Photographer of the Year, an annual contest celebrating close-up macro and micro photography. The shortlist for this year's competition is now live online at cupoti.com and the winner will be announced in a few weeks' time. You'll also find the winners from last year on there, and for the purposes of this presentation what I'm going to do is share with you some of the tips and techniques that last year's entrants provided, trying to, in a way to kind of overcome some of the stumbling blocks that people have with close-up work, namely finding inspiration, equipment and technique, backgrounds, composition, reducing camera and subject movement, depth of field and lighting. Now, if you want the full technical details to any of the pictures we are looking at today, then you'll find them on the website underneath the captions. So to begin with, I thought we'd look at this idea of what to photograph and the power of research. Now, the curator and historian Beaumont Newell had a fantastic quote, which is, "We're not interested in the unusual, we're interested in the usual seen unusually." And I think this is a fantastic quote because it summarises everything I love about close-up photography, that you could be photographing anything from a plant pot to a cheese grater, and you can really elevate it if you look at this particular object with something that people refer to as a beginner's mind. And that's looking at an object as though you've never seen it before, with a kind of childlike curiosity. To give an example, last year Jeff Defoe, one of the entrants, he sent in a photograph that made the top 100 of a plant pot that had algal growth on it, and it really looked like a sort of abstract painting. It was absolutely beautiful. And then we had Jane Simmons, who had a couple of images in the top 100, and she photographs flowers often in her garden or not far from home, and it just goes to show that you don't really need to go far to find something that's worth photographing. So the first picture I wanted to share with you is one of Jane's, and I'd like to read what she said about her image. "Mauve-coloured Michaelmas daisies grow wild against a wall bordering our garden. I collected a few flowers late one summer and photographed some petals on my light pad at home, overexposing to give a high-key effect and show the delicate beauty of the petals. I wasn't using a tripod, so I set a high shutter speed and relatively high ISO and manually focused. I was using a manual focus lens to get a decent amount of sharpness in the petals. The resulting image reminded me of Japanese calligraphy, hence the title, Petal Calligraphy." Now, I'm not sure what light pad Jane was actually using, but I've used a very cheap version from a car boot sale before, but I've just invested in something called a Caterpillar Glow, which has got a really, has got some really good reviews, and I've just started using that, which is great. But I would say with light pad photography, a few things to bear in mind are that every single blemish, every little piece of dust is going to show up in the picture. So you really want to remove those at the time of creation. So I'd use a paintbrush or some tweezers. Otherwise you'll be spending hours in post-processing trying to clean it up. And also be aware of breezes, because one breeze and the whole lot will end up on the floor. So the next thing I want to talk about is linked to Jane's picture, and that's the kind of benefits of staying local and really getting to know a local area. I don't think you can overestimate how much your photography will improve if you get to know a place intimately. So you go there in all seasons, in all weathers, usually somewhere close to home, preferably somewhere you can walk to. When you become familiar with a place, you really do get to know all of its kind of moods. And Greg Whitten last year, he said you can lose yourself in an area no bigger than a squash court. And I think that's absolutely right. But I'd also say you can lose yourself in an area no bigger than 1 square metre. That's the joy of close-up photography. So choose somewhere that you can pop out to regularly and have the camera ready at all times. So there's no excuse not to go out. And if you're out gardening, take the camera out with you, because when you're pruning or moving a plant, often insects will come out when they've been disturbed, and they give great opportunities for pictures. So yeah, exploring a small area, really, the value of it can't be overestimated. And in a similar way, I like the fact that a few entrants were mentioning this idea that you should grow or build something. So if you want, if there's a particular flower that you want to photograph, don't go to the florist and look for it. Take the long game and just plant it yourself. And then you'll know exactly what you're going to get, and you'll have something right on your doorstep. And similarly, Tina Claffey from last year, she mentioned building your own pond. So if you want to attract damselflies or particular kind of wildlife, build your own pond, leave an area of it without marginal plants on the edge so that you can get right down to the water level, and you really will see the benefits. If you take the long game, you really will see the benefits. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was setting yourself a project. Now, I love a project. I rarely finish them, but that's not really the point. I think if you set yourself a project and it makes you get out and take pictures every day, then it's done its job. Now, someone who does complete projects and is brilliant at them is last year's winner, Emmanuel Biggie. And he set himself the challenge of photographing all the mimetic animals in a tropical rainforest in Madagascar. Now, that's quite extreme, but I think it's a good example of how sticking with one thing isn't a limitation, quite the opposite. It really means that you can expand your creativity. So I wanted to show you one of Emmanuel's pictures and read you what he said about it. Seeing a mossy leaf-tailed gecko like this during the day was really tricky because they blend into their environment perfectly. The fringes along the edge of their body make every cast shadow disappear, allowing them to become part of the tree trunk and moss. Only their eyes, if wide open, can betray their presence. This shot was taken close to the Andesi-Matadia National Park, where the survival of these amazing creatures is threatened by deforestation, and only the park's presence can save them from future extinction. Now, what I love about Emmanuel is the fact that he teams his photography with conservation efforts, and he really does know his stuff. He does plenty of research beforehand on animal behaviour, and that's something that we're going to look at in a second. Now, one other tip is with close-up is to look high and look low. Now, having a subject that's quite small often means that we can look down on it, we can look from the side, we can often look up under it. So really, experiment with camera orientation, experiment with cropping, really do explore the subject thoroughly. Get out of your comfort zone a little bit with it. And if you're photographing an animal in particular, then you really do want to get down to eye level with it to create a greater connection. Now, one entrant last year said something which I thought was really interesting, and he said, if your subject has eyes, get at or below these. If not, imagine your focal point is an eye and do the same. And it never occurred to me to do that, and I think it's a really good piece of advice. But what I will say if you're getting down low is make sure you're comfortable, because if you get wet, if you get cramp, whatever, you're just going to stop taking pictures. So wear waterproof trousers, get up now and again, just really make sure that you're comfortable, because it really will increase the time out shooting. Now, the next tip is going to be tell a story. Now, as humans, we love to tell a story. We love to connect things together. And sometimes the best pictures can be found when you're seeking stories, whether it be plants, animals. They really do help to kind of engage with a viewer. And a lot of the entrants last year had written comments in their captions like, this mother plant was protecting its young, or this big mushroom was protecting its baby brother. So it really gives you an idea as to how we like to create these stories. So the next tip, kind of following on from the above, is going to be about showing an element of behaviour. Now, I've seen a lot of pretty pictures of animals in the last sort of 20 years, but nearly all of them would have been elevated slightly if they'd shown an element of some sort of behaviour, whether it's a bird preening, or whether it's a plant that's entangled with another plant, or whatever it might be. You really can lift a picture by showing an element of behaviour. But in order to do that, you really need to know about that plant or animal. So research is absolutely fundamental. Now, somebody who's absolutely brilliant at this is Ellen Woods, and last year she had a couple of pictures in the top 100. She's a PhD biology student, so she really knows her stuff, and the picture I wanted to show you today, cover your eyes if you don't like spiders, that's all I'll say. So I'd just like to share with you what Ellen had to say about her picture. I was walking around in waist-high water in Bigelow Hollow State Park, Connecticut, where there were exposed hummocks of sphagnum moss harbouring sundews and their arthropod prey. While I had initially set out to photograph the sundews, my attention quickly shifted upon encountering this beer moth of a fishing spider. It was the biggest spider I had or have ever seen in the northeastern United States, and could have covered my entire palm. I'm not afraid of spiders, but being caught off guard, I almost dropped my camera in the water. Fishing spiders typically live near the water and can walk on the water's surface to hunt for insects and small fish, hence their name. This particular spider was eating a dragonfly, which also provides a sense of scale. Now, let's just gloss over the fact that this spider could have been the size of someone's palm. But Ellen really knows about her subject. She knows that that spider is much more interested in eating something than is in her. So she was able to get a photograph. And also, she went to get one thing, but she was flexible enough to change her approach and photograph something else. But knowing how that subject behaved really made sure that she could get a photograph that was above, elevated above the normal picture. So you could, a lot of the entrants were saying it doesn't matter if what you're photographing is a bubble or a wave or a plant or an animal. Knowing something about how that subject behaves is always going to be beneficial to your work. So whether you're photographing a butterfly, most of us know that butterflies are best shot in the morning when they're cooler, before they've warmed up. But you can go beyond that and step back, and you could say, okay, I know when a butterfly is going to fly, but can I go back and look and see where are there caterpillars, for instance? And if I can't find the caterpillars, can I find signs of them? Caterpillar poo, leaves that are nibbled. Do I know which plants this caterpillar and this butterfly like to spend time on? And knowing those little details will really help you plan a picture and really help you make the most of the situation once you get there. You can use field guides, you can use apps, but first-hand research is always going to be the best way to do it. So the next tip is really to have an image in your mind's eye, which is what we've just talked about really, but to remain flexible. And I like to keep a little sketchbook. I draw something if I think of an idea. But someone who really did pre-visualise a shot was last year's Young Close-Up Photographer of the Year winner, and that was Josiah Launstein. And I'd just like to read to you what Josiah said about his picture. I spotted several monkey moth caterpillars making their way down the trees near the lodge we were staying at in Thailand. I wanted to silhouette one against the overcast sky. Unfortunately, we hadn't brought much gear with us and I didn't have a macro lens. I decided to use the telephoto lens I usually use for wildlife and just crept up until I was at the minimum focusing distance. Then I had to find a caterpillar that was coming down perfectly perpendicular to my lens so I could keep it and all its amazing hair in focus. I don't think I had really noticed the raindrops until I started crafting my image, and right away I realised that was one of the coolest parts. It took me a few frames before I got what I wanted, but I was really excited with the way this one turned out, and he should have been, because it's an amazing picture. But it just goes to show that Josiah was flexible, and he changed his approach slightly, but he also changed his gear. He didn't have his macro lens on him, so he made the most of his telephoto. So you don't always have to have everything you need, but you just need to be adaptable. So the next tip is to find the best specimen. So look for a butterfly without tattered wings. Look for a plant that hasn't got any tears or blemishes, because in macro and close-up, every tiny blemish will be magnified and can often spoil a picture. So following on from that as well is check the weather forecast. Now, if the wind speed is above sort of 10 miles per hour, I tend to avoid flower photography, but you can, if you really want to go out there, you can just look for flowers with thicker stems, or you can photograph bark or something immobile, or you can use props, which we'll talk about later. But remember that the slightest blur really will be magnified, and plant will be whipping across the frame. But at the same time, don't be put off by bad weather, because overcast conditions are fantastic for a lot of close-up work. Overcast conditions reduce the contrast, they can saturate colours. So if the sun is out, most people will wait for a cloud to go over it to act as a natural diffuser. So the next point, if relevant, is to check the tides. Now, obviously there's the safety aspect and why you want to check tides, but also when there's been a high tide and it's retreating, often it'll unveil surface patterns in rocks. It might wash up something interesting. It will make colours more saturated. So there's a lot to be gained from knowing what the tides are doing if you're down for some coastal photography. Now, somebody who I really rate in this area is Nora Kirkback. And Nora knows two of her greatest passions in photography are sand patterns and flies. Now, I haven't seen her fly pictures, but I have seen her sand patterns. And I'm going to share one of those with you today because I think it's brilliant. So this is what Nora had to say about this image. A picture like this depends on the light, how low the sun is, the angle you choose, the reflections from the sky, and so on. I love the light during winter in Norway, but we only get a few hours of daylight during the darkest period of the year, and the tide has to correspond with the lightest hours. It's usually cold, windy and wet, so I use plastic bags on my knees, and I bought a pair of wellies that are 3 sizes too big so I can put extra socks on in an effort to keep the cold out. I just love the idea of Nora just walking around the beach with oversized wellies on. Now the next batch of tips are about equipment and technique. And the first thing to say about equipment is if you're interested in getting to close-up and macro photography and you don't have a macro lens, don't worry. So many people are put off because they think they need to buy a dedicated macro lens to get real close. But in fact there are so many cheaper ways to when you're starting out. You might want to explore looking at getting reversing rings or extension tubes or close-up attachment lenses. In fact I just tried out the Nissi filter kit a while ago and it was absolutely brilliant. The optical quality was superb. So there are cheaper ways of doing it. Obviously having a macro lens will give you the best optical quality, but if you're just starting out or you're not sure if it's for you, don't be put off by the cost, because you really don't have to spend a huge deal just to reduce the minimum focusing distance, which is effectively what you're trying to do. And also, as we've seen with Josiah's picture, you can take some amazing close-up pictures with telephoto lens, wide-angle lenses, even fisheye lenses. And also at the moment there's a real fashion for using vintage lenses, which are generally manual focus, and for using more unusual optics such as the Lens Baby Velvet 56. So they're also worth looking into because they're a bit cheaper than your standard macro lens. But if you do decide you want to really get into close-up and macro and you want a macro lens, then I would say buy second hand. MPB do some brilliant close-up equipment second hand, or you could hire it, or of course you've got brands like Sigma and Tamron that do an amazing macro range. So look at those options first, because you don't have to spend a huge amount. So when it comes to sort of technique, obviously when you're photographing very close to something, the depth of field is extremely limited, and in close-up that usually is it can be millimeters. So even if you put the lens, the macro lens, to sort of f22, you're not going to get complete front to back sharpness. You will get a very, very narrow plane of acceptable focus. So you either have to embrace that or you'll just get frustrated. So one of the things I would say is there's nothing wrong with keeping the lens wide open. You can take some incredible pictures at sort of f2.8. Close-up doesn't always have to be about trying to get extensive depth of field. In fact, you can get brilliant impressionist images keeping the lens wide open, and somebody who's really good at that is an entrant from last year, Sophie Spurgeon, and I wanted to share one of her pictures with you because I think it really does show what can be achieved. So I'll read what Sophie had to say about her picture. I have a wild cherry tree in my garden which has small insignificant blooms during the winter. However, when examined closely, they are exquisitely beautiful. This picture was made by combining 2 photos. The Lens Baby Velvet 56 lens makes flowers beautifully soft at f2.8, but I like to introduce some detail to the stamens. To achieve this, I blended elements of the soft shot with a sharper version taken at f11. I used the natural light of my conservatory, but the flower stem was quite dark underneath, so I lit it with a little Manfrotto Lumimuse. The background is a coloured card echoing the pink of the stamens. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Lumimuse later on, but I hope you can see that by keeping the lens wide open, you really can achieve some beautiful effects. So the next tip really is, well, it's not really a tip, it's kind of essential: use a tripod. Now, they're heavy, I get it. They can be cumbersome to set up, I get it. They can slow you down, which I personally don't think is a bad thing, I get it. But I think what you'll find is if you get used to setting your tripod up quickly at home and, just of an evening practice, then I think you'll find your hit rate will go up tremendously. Because when we set our camera on the tripod, it slows us down, it allows us to concentrate on the composition. We don't have to worry about whether the camera's steady, and really with close-up, the last thing you want to worry about is keeping yourself steady and the camera steady, because everything is magnified. So personally, I use a tripod with a central column that we can position at 90 degrees, which allows me to shoot down on a subject. But really what you want to look for is something like that, or something where the legs can be splayed out completely so you can get really close to the ground. But on the flip side, the next tip would be, don't be afraid of a bit of intentional blur. So obviously we don't want movement where we don't want it, but there will be occasions where a bit of ICM or intentional camera movement will actually help the picture and benefit it. So don't be afraid of a little bit of blur when it's intentional. Just experiment. And one technique which I've been enjoying people from last year's competition, particularly Jane Simmons used with a beautiful picture of some lichen, is multiple exposures with close-up photography, either in camera or in post-processing. Now, multiple exposures take a little bit of trial and error. There's no dream formula as to how to do them. Just because your camera can shoot 9 frames and combine them doesn't mean you need to use the full 9. In fact, you can often get better effects with just combining 3 or 4 pictures. So just experiment a little bit. It can be good fun. The next tip is don't discount black and white. I see so few close-up black and white pictures, but when I do, they really stand out. So it can definitely be worth trying black and white, but don't just shoot colour and then convert it to see what it looks like. Go out with your black and white eyes on. Really look at shape, look at form, look at repeating patterns, look at how to reduce a scene to its core elements, all those basic things we do with black and white photography. Now the next tip is check the edges of the frame. All of us have had bits of grass, twigs, things poking around the edges of the frame that have pretty much destroyed a picture. Obviously you can remove some of these in post-processing later, but you really are much better off if you can eliminate them one way or another when you're taking the picture. So use live view, magnify the frame, have a good look around the whole thing before you take the picture. Now the next thing, which is really important with close-up work, is to remember your ethics. Basically, if you're dealing with a wild animal or a wild plant, just treat it with a bit of kindness and a bit of respect. It's a living being after all. And someone who's really on this is Petter Sabol, who just had a brilliant quote last year, and it was just, don't do anything harmful to your subject like fixing it, freezing, spraying, or anything unethical to get a photograph. There is always a fair and normal way to get a picture. And I think this relates back to what we were talking about earlier with the behaviour. If you know how an animal behaves, you'll notice if it's distressed, or you'll be able to predict when it will do something that you want it to do. You shouldn't ever have to force something to perform for you. So I just wanted to share with you one of Petter's pictures because it really does show that what can be achieved with a bit of knowledge and a bit of respect. I found this little fellow in a local meadow in Croatia, just a few hundred metres from the village. It was a rather cold and calm morning, with the insects slow to wake up, making it ideal for some extreme macro photography. I carefully set up my tripod with focus stacking rails so as not to scare the damselfly. Once I was in position, I could see how beautiful his colours were and how detailed the compound eyes were, and I couldn't wait to get started. But it didn't go as smoothly as I hoped. Even the lightest breeze meant I had to stop the sequence and start again. Then my model started scratching his head. Now, I love that description from Petter because it shows that it's harder to photograph an insect like that when it's alive. It is harder, but how much more rewarding is it to get that shot? It's absolutely beautiful. And following on from that, something which the most amount of entrants mentioned was this whole idea of slowing down. Close-up photography is not something you can do in a rush. It's not street photography, it's not reportage, it's not sport photography. One of the benefits is that you have to slow down to shoot close-up, and that slowing down is so beneficial to our well-being as well as our photography. So be patient, stay in a scene longer than you would when everyone else has packed up and gone home. Stick it out, stay that little bit longer. It really, really will make the difference to you and your pictures. Now, the next area we're going to talk about is backgrounds, really. Now, the first thing to say about backgrounds is that a background can make or break a close-up shot. So you really should be giving equal consideration between subject and background. Now, something that I find quite useful is having a very basic understanding of colour theory. And if you're not sure about that, you can just download an artist wheel from the internet, and you can look at which colours contrast and which complement each other. So in terms of backgrounds, you've got the option, you've got man-made backgrounds and you've got natural backgrounds. Now, I personally like to use a plastic background from a company called Photo Boards that have a texture effect on them. But I also use at home, I use old bits of wood, old doors. And a tip from the food photographer Donna Cruz, who's brilliant, she suggested using battered old baking tins as a backdrop, and I think that's fantastic. And she also uses old newspapers that she buys off the internet, which I think is great too. And Perdita Petzel from last year, one of her pictures was taken with her black backpack behind a plant stem that had a caterpillar on it, and it was really, really effective. So explore backgrounds. And something that I really liked last year was a picture by Andrew Wilson, and I'm just going to read to you the story behind it because it really goes to show that anything around the house can become a suitable background if you're aware of things like colour theory and the balance between subject and background. This photo of my girlfriend's cactus was taken in our living room nearly 2 years ago. I was experimenting with macro, and this was the first time I had really considered using a background to complement the subject. We were in the middle of securing a mortgage and a red folder from a banking company was lying around. This did the job perfectly. I used an aperture of f2.8 to isolate the spiky ridge of the cactus from its main body. To get most of the ridge sharp, I had to get the plane of focus as parallel as possible to it. To light the cactus, I used a Joby Gorilla Torch and wrapped the legs around my lens. I wouldn't normally light a subject from such a direct angle relative to the camera, but I liked the uniform look. It illuminated the ridge and body of the cactus without casting shadows, especially when diffused with greaseproof paper. So that sums up quite a few of the things that I love about close-up. He's used the greaseproof paper, it's a homemade diffuser. He's used something that was lying around as a backdrop, perfect. He's used his imagination to pre-visualise what the picture will look like when he added in these elements, and I think that's fantastic. So the next area we're going to look at is composition. And composition for close-up photography is the same as composition for normal photography or general photography. A lot of people get so hung up on trying to get things sharp or get everything steady that composition goes out the window close-up. So it's important to remember that all the things still apply. Lead-in lines, rule of thirds, all of those things still apply. So be aware of them when you're composing. They don't apply in the terms of having a fence that's leading up a mountain or whatever, but you'll see it in the lines of petals and things like that. So it's really, really good to just be aware of it. And of course, the same thing applies again, that you can throw the rules out the window and go with your gut, because in photography, sometimes the rules don't make sense for us and we just want to follow our instinct. So also remember to be a bit free about it too. Now, one of the things I found interesting is some of the entrants talked about the idea of finding order in chaos. And I think that's what we do as photographers. We're looking for those scenes within a scene. We're looking to make sense out of something. And entrant Carolyn Barber, she said, look for patterns, shapes and lines. And also David Morgan, another entrant, he said he spotted in a rock face what looked like an aerial road map linking some barnacles and limpets together, and that helped him to find some order in the chaos. So really do look for repetitive patterns, shapes, forms that will help you make some sort of sense out of what you're seeing. Also, it's really important to consider the negative space in a picture. Now, I've never really been a fan of the term negative space because it implies an absence of something, but in fact negative space can be quite an energetic area, and it's just as important as the positive space or the space where your subject fills. So really give the negative space some consideration, think how it balances with the positive space. It really does make a huge difference. The next tip is about supporting your subject. Now, if you're out and things are a little bit breezy, you've got a couple of options really in terms of support. I like to use something called a Wimberley plamp, which not only is brilliantly known, but is really helpful and useful. It's like having an extra arm, an extra articulated arm. And what it does is one end clips to your tripod leg or fence post, whatever, and the other end has got like a little pincer clip on it that will hold something delicate like a flower stem steady. And I think it's brilliant. I use it to hold diffusers sometimes, or reflectors, all that kind of thing. So you could use that, or you could use a tiny bit of floristry wire that might tie the stem of a plant to something more solid next to it. Or you could create a windbreak by getting someone to stand behind your subject, or you could bring you can get pop-up windbreaks that you could take with you. So you've got some options. And then the next thing really would be to think about how you're going to keep the camera steady. Now, we've talked about tripod. we can also think about some tripod alternatives. So I use a beanbag a lot. And one of the things I absolutely loved about Tina Claffey, who I mentioned earlier, is that she uses a child swimming armband because she photographs in bogs a lot. So she just pops the armband on the ground and lets out the amount of air she wants to give herself a nice position, which I thought was really good. Obviously, you'll want to use a remote release or a self-timer when you're using the tripod. And there are various ways of maximising your depth of field, because when you're shooting, your lens is close to a subject, extremely close to a subject, and you're using magnifications that are often 1:1 or life size, then depth of field is going to be seriously limited, often to a couple of millimetres. So there are various ways to maximise your depth of field, and one of them obviously is to change the aperture, but as we've spoken about before, that's not going to make a huge amount of difference. Another tip is to keep the camera parallel as possible to the subject, but another alternative is to use a technique called focus stacking. Now, essentially what focus stacking is when you shoot a number of images of the same subject at very slightly different focal points, and then you combine them, usually using software such as Zareen Stacker or Helicon Focus. Now, to carry out focus stacking, you really need some consistent light for one thing, and you also need a really steady support. So I have seen it done handheld. In fact, Oliver Wright has done a lovely video on YouTube where you can see him doing it handheld. But I would say if you want ultimate control, then you're really going to have to support your camera on a tripod with some focusing rails. So yeah, focusing stacking, there are tons of videos online showing you how to do it. I don't do it much myself, but it's definitely something I'm looking to get into this winter. So have a go at it. Now, one thing I would say about focusing is obviously where you focus is where the viewer's eye is going to be drawn to first in the picture. So it is really important. So I would take advantage of all the focusing aids on your camera. So get the manual out, have a look, because you might have something called split screen focusing, you might have focus peaking, or in the very least you're going to be able to magnify the screen and check where you're focusing. So make sure you make use of those features. Some will be more useful to you than others. I, for instance, don't really like focus peaking, but you'll find which one works best for you, and that can be really helpful. The majority of the time though, when I'm shooting close up, I use manual focus because autofocus can really struggle due to lack of contrast and the proximity of the subject and the lens. So you want to be able to make sure that your manual focus technique is really up to scratch. And somebody who really knows how to draw the viewer's eye to the right part of the picture is Rachel Chappell, and she did a beautiful picture of an iris last year. So I just want to read you what she said about this image. Where this iris had started to fade, it created a series of sweeping lines arcing around the petal. I used a shallow depth of field to draw attention to the lines while softly echoing the lines further back. These flowers are a natural demonstration of contrast in the colour wheel, with the blue and yellow parts making each colour appear more vibrant. It was not until I was editing on the computer that the lines reminded me of crashing waves, with the band of yellow acting as a distant swathe of sand on a sunlit beach. So Rachel there is covering quite a few of the things that we've already talked about. The concept of having an understanding of colour theory, for instance, the idea of looking for a story in a scene when she was talking about the crashing wave, and of course her control of focusing is incredible there. I mean, the plane of focus is so narrow, but she knows exactly where she wants it. So it really is worth experimenting with that, and as I say, trying out some of the focusing aids on your camera. Now, the next area we're going to look at is lighting. And the one thing I will say, whether you choose to use flash or continuous lighting or natural lighting, is don't try to fake it later, because you're always going to get a better result if the light is right at the time you take the picture. So, whether it takes research or whatever it might take, make sure that you're giving yourself the best chance at the time of exposure. You might want to experiment with backlighting, which can help your subject stand out from its surrounding. You might like to backlight with a light pad or a torch, or something that Sophie Spurgeon was using, which is the Manfrotto Lumimuse, which is like a little LED that you can use to shine up under mushrooms or plants or things like that, to add just a splash of continuous lighting. And because it's continuous, you have absolute control over it. You know exactly what the result is going to look like, which I always find quite helpful, and I do use one of those. Now, I'm a big fan of using natural light. So obviously natural light you can manipulate in various ways. You can use diffusers, reflectors. as we said before, the sun is a natural diffuser, and there are various ways, white card where you can bounce it back onto the subject. So I'd always explore with natural light first. But if you do want to use artificial light, obviously we've got the continuous form in terms of LEDs, and then we've got flash. Now there are dedicated flashes for macro photography. You've got the twin light flash, or you've got a ring light flash. All I would say with flash is whatever you use, don't use the pop-up flash on your camera, because you're going to cast a shadow over your subject, the light is too harsh and it will be uneven. So really you're looking at some sort of specialist gear when you're looking at sort of flash for macro, which can be a bit pricey, but the results you can get with it are incredible. So do investigate that side of it. And obviously using a flash will help you maintain a fast shutter speed as well, which can be crucial when you're looking at wildlife or insects or anything like that. Now, something I wanted to end on really was a couple of the entrants mentioned the idea of close-up photography being connected to well-being and sort of mindfulness, and I really love the idea of really making it count. And reading through some of the stories, there was a story from Carolyn Barber, for instance, who she works as a hospice nurse, and she talked about how in her spare time she takes photographs and then she would share them with some of the patients there who couldn't go outside, which I thought was really moving. And I love that idea of giving something back or contributing with your photography. And I wanted to leave really on a quote from Geraint Radford, who said, "The best tip is have fun. It really shows in your pictures." And I think that is the best advice anyone can give you. Just have fun. And with close-up, experiment, because you never know what you're going to get. So thanks very much for joining me today. I hope you found the tips useful. If you'd like to be part of the Kupoti community, please go onto our website and sign up to our newsletter, where you'll get regular ramblings from me mainly, but hopefully some things that you might find useful in terms of inspiration and creativity. So enjoy the rest of the show, and thanks again. Bye.